Welcome to the Insomnia Project. Sit back, relax, and listen as we have a conversation about the mundane, one that will hopefully help you sort of drift off. Thank you for joining us. I'm Marco Timpano. I'm also in Florida, so for our listeners, you know what that means. I have an episode with my father-in-law, Daniel Barker. Dan, welcome to the Insomnia Project.
Thank you.
Now, Daniel, our first episode that I recorded with you was about cymbals because you're a drummer.
Mm-hmm.
And you worked in a cymbal factory, and you pretty much know all things cymbal. But now I'd like to talk about drums and specifically drummers, because you're a drummer. How did you get into drums?
Well, for me it was pretty simple. Back around the early 60s, this group came from England called the Beatles.
Oh.
And all of a sudden you realize all these girls are going crazy over these four guys. And so, being a young 12-year-old, a couple of kids in the neighborhood, we would just kind of pantomime their records and stand in front of a mirror trying to do the moves. So what drew me to it really was girls.
Oh. So not wanting to emulate Ringo Starr, just wanting to emulate the popularity that the Beatles had.
Yeah, what I found out was that, everybody had their favorite Beatles, so that was fine. Ringo was kind of the guy that was quiet in his own way, even though he was a bit of a buffoon at times. But a lot of the girls really went for him because of his demeanor. He was quiet and sullen face up there, etc. So there we go. I just imitated the way he looked.
I see. And how is he as a drummer?
He's actually very underrated.
Really?
Yeah. He's a self-taught drummer. The thing with Ringo is that he has a style that I was able to emulate because he's left-handed, and he's playing a right-handed drum set.
Oh, I see.
So it's not as, let's say, natural for him to do a lot of the stuff other drummers do. But that gave him a bit of a boxy, percussive, very hard-driving beat. And that's what the Beatles liked about him, because he played so differently.
So he was a left-handed drummer playing a right-handed drum kit, is that correct?
Right.
Is it because there weren't left-handed drum kits at the time?
No, actually all you got to do is move a couple of the drums to make it that way.
Okay.
But the thing is, such as in my case, I'm sure that he was taught to play like the way most drummers played, so nobody gave it a thought that he was left-handed or right-handed or whatever.
How did you learn?
Well, for the most part, I was self-taught,
Okay.
Emulating and copying what I heard on records, etc. It wasn't until I got out of the Army that I took professional drum lessons.
Oh, wow.
The concept back there, back in those days, was that a lot of the songs are very simple.
Mm-hmm.
So, we used to call them three-chord progressions, and that just meant that they were actually very simple to play. So once you get one or two or three beats down, then you could just about do everything that was out there.
And is that different today?
Oh yeah, much different. Even back in the 70s, things started changing. You started having groups, whether it was Chicago, Blood, Sweat, and Tears, the horn groups, or the jazz players were getting into a mixture of a rock jazz thing going on. And jazz, what I mean by that for a drummer is that different time signatures were coming out. It wasn't just a 4/4 or 3/4, 2/4 time. You might be playing something that's, say, more jazz-oriented, 5/4 as an example. Dave Brubeck, the drum was Joe Morello. And instead of playing in 4, which meant 4 beats to the measure.
This is what a time signature is.
Yeah.
Okay.
He was playing 5. And that just changed the whole thing around. So it progressed musically.
And I would imagine that the prevalence of Latin music also influenced how drums were played in traditional rock bands and whatnot.
Yeah. I mean, look at Woodstock and Santana getting up on stage. All of a sudden we saw congas and bongos and other things. But if you go back, a little historical thing here, back in the 50s and the 40s, a very big influence was Cuban music.
Right.
And one of the best aficionados of that was a bebop gentleman who I got to know, Dizzy Gillespie.
Oh.
And Dizzy Gillespie actually would come down to the factory because he had a certain couple of cymbals that he always wanted his guys to play. I mean, he had very acute tastes and hearing. But he would show us the old Cuban Latin rhythms. And these things were, talk about 5/4. I mean, you'd be talking 12/8 or 11/8, something that's so odd that you'd have to count it out in your head and not just listen to the music to try to fit it in. But back in those days, and even today, if you go to Cuba, the band will consist of 3 or 4 percussionists, conga player, bongo player, somebody on maracas and other sundry percussive instruments. So that influence was really always there, but kind of got hidden after the Beatles and then resurfaced.
Wow. It's interesting because I've never heard you talk about Dizzy Gillespie and having met the person.
Oh, yeah.
What was he like?
Very much a gentleman. Now, I got to know him because he would come to the factory, and he would come 2-3 times a year. Whenever he played up in the Boston area, he would stop in. And he always had top-notch players with him, so what we would hang out at the factory, and that would be something he liked to do because he could talk and talk music because we were all drummers, etc. And he was very much a gentleman. He was back in the 40s and 50s when he was coming up. He was quite a player. He was one of the beginning of bebop. Was Dizzy led the charge there, and the thing is that he expanded beyond the jazz of the times to get into that whole thing, and he was quite a player. But when I got to know him, he had the puffy cheeks,
sure,
and his act was more of a quote-unquote shtick,
right?
Because people expected to see his jowls go out as he played, etc.
Right.
And they really didn't understand, some of the music that he originated and how complicated it was to play. So he would just play to the crowd by that time as he was getting older. But very kind man. Grew up in a very tough era, very racial, emotive. It was tough for him to go back home to South Carolina and play,
right?
Being black and etc. But no, he was quite a guy.
If you want to know more about the factory, we did an episode on cymbals in season 1, so I recommend that people go back and check out that episode. Who are some other drummers that have a unique style or a style that you think is underrated?
Well, going back a few years ago, you start at the top.
Sure.
I mean, Gene Krupa, Buddy Rich, Louis Bellson. Louis Bellson was married to Pearl Bailey.
Okay.
And you just go down the line of the big band drummers and the jazz drummers of the time. A lot of them underrated, a lot of them, just tremendous players. Some of the ones that you get into innovation, and some of them go to what I would call extremes. I mean, there was one young man who went up through Berkeley and all of the jazz and all that. And last time I saw him, he was playing with twigs that he would cut off branches of trees rather than regular drumsticks.
Okay.
And the reason is, he said, well, it's so much more natural. And you look at him and go, yeah, well, that's interesting,
right.
Isn't it? So he's out there cutting limbs off trees for his sticks. But, you know, it would progress not just in one area, one way or one area. It would just kind of blossom. And certain drummers made their money because they could imitate and emulate a lot of that. A friend of mine, whose name was Bernard Purdy. Bernard was Aretha Franklin's drummer.
Okay.
From New York, did a lot of playing. And he's on a lot of recordings. We used to have a joke in the industry, and it would show the Beatles in their outfits there. I'm trying to think of what the name of the album was.
Sgt. Pepper's?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Sgt. Pepper's in those outfits. And instead of Ringo, they supplanted Bernard, who was black, in the uniform. Because Bernard would say, yeah, I played on Beatles records, and people would ask, well, which ones? And back in the day, the drummer usually was the first recording before the other players.
Because they set
the right, them and the bass player.
Right.
And so Bernard would go, yeah, well, I played quite a bit. I don't know. You know, because as he was very honest, he'd say, I don't know which ones made it on the album. I don't know which ones got canned. You know, that never happened.
So would he be recording his drum beat before Ringo would lay his on the album?
No, it would be in lieu of Ringo sometimes.
Okay.
If you go back to Sgt. Pepper's and everything beyond, you'll notice that there's a lot of different rhythms in there. And, you know, Ringo's a very good drummer, but he had a certain way of playing that always sounded the same.
Right, okay.
And so they would bring in other people to play around them.
I see. Now,
I mean, even something, let me just point out one of the early records, Love Me Do. Ringo didn't play on that.
Oh, really?
No, a studio drummer did. And, you know, it wasn't that tough a beat to play.
Sure.
But nonetheless, you know, no, it wasn't Ringo. And, of course, as the Beatles progressed, they brought in a lot of other musicians. You know, keyboard players and guitar players, etc. So,
of course. Now, you have a great story about a friend of yours who played with Elvis.
Oh, yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, the gentleman's name was Larry London, and I met him back when I was playing in the late 60s. He came in the factory to pick out a set of cymbals, and at that point, his career was, he actually started off as a singer, and when I knew him, he was a singer. But he took up playing drums and became one of the drummers of Motown.
Wow.
Back in the day. And from Motown in Detroit, Chet Atkins came across him and said, why don't you move to Nashville? We're doing quite a bit of recordings and I could use you. So he went to Nashville, and he was one of the most recorded drummers, not just in country, but in a lot of areas. He was a powerhouse guy, drummer, one of the best. And he played on several cuts of Journey and other top groups.
Right.
And he was, what happened is that Elvis always kept his musicians for a long time. And he had this drummer, excellent drummer, and he was from L.A., and Elvis says, well, we're going to take a break here. And this was really before he got into the Las Vegas thing.
Right.
And so these people were all put on retainer, and back in those days, the drummer's retainer was $50,000 a year.
Impressive.
Just to be there. And that was a lot of money back then. That would be like $250,000 today.
Sure.
But Elvis always took care of his people. And this guy's name was Ron Tutt. And Ron went back to L.A. and started doing some recording business. Helen Reddy and a lot of the recordings of the time that came out was Ron Tutt. So he's doing okay here, day in and day out, playing on the recording. So after about a year and a half, I think it was, I don't think it was quite 2 years, Elvis says, okay, I'm ready. I want to get on the road, etc. And Ron says, well, Elvis, I really don't want to give this up. I'm having a great time. I get to sleep in my own bed every night. You know, my wife cooks a meal. It's great. So says, okay, well, you know, we wish you the best, and there we go. So what happens is that they audition drummers. Well, Larry London gets the gig. So they're in rehearsal, ready to go out, and Ron Tutt calls Elvis and says, man, I made a mistake.
Oh.
And Elvis, you know, was put in that terrible position. And so he goes to Larry and he says, hey, man, you know, Ron wants to come back. And Larry, always a gentleman, and I learned quite a bit from him this way. He said, well, he's been with you for years, Elvis. I understand. And Elvis looked at Larry and said, man, I really appreciate that. He said, I'm going to pay you for the whole tour.
Right.
And Larry said, no. I don't want the money. All I ask of you is, if anything ever happens to Ron, that I get the call first. And Elvis said, I promise you. So what happens? They're out on tour. Ron Tutt's doing the gig, etc. And out of the blue, Larry gets a call. They were playing up in Detroit that night. And what happened in rehearsal is Ron Tutt walked off the stage. He fell off the stage.
Oh.
Broke a leg. I believe it was a leg or an arm. I don't remember which. But he couldn't play. And so Larry gets a call. And Larry says, yep, I'll be up there for the gig tonight. He had to book like 3 plane seats to put his drums on the plane. They fly up to Detroit. He doesn't get much of a rehearsal at all, just gets right to the venue and off they go. And that was the last tour that Elvis did.
Wow.
So Larry finished up that tour. And he had a lot of great stories. He once was invited to Vidalia, Georgia. I remember this because it's the onion capital of Georgia.
Okay.
And he flies in a small plane. They pick him up, and they've got a parade all set up with a high school band and everything to march through town.
Right.
They put him on this chair up on a flatbed.
Okay.
And he's waving to the crowd. And everybody wanted to see Elvis's drummer.
What was he like as a person?
He was great.
Yeah.
You know, I consider him one of the nice things about my career is a lot of these guys became friends. They weren't just business colleagues or associates. And Larry was one of those. He would go out of his way if you needed help.
Right.
You know. I'll tell you one other quick story,
Sure.
which I think is important. Is back in the days, it was Larry and about 5 other guys that were doing all the recording out of Nashville. And they get a call for this young artist. And so they go in the studio. And they're playing. And this girl's singing. And the producer is saying, no, I want you to do this. I want you to do that. And the big thing at the time in country was Tammy Wynette.
Right.
I want you to sing like Tammy Wynette. And she wasn't very comfortable doing that, and she was singing her own songs. And Larry and the guys take a break, smoke break outside, and they're talking, going, man, he's going to ruin her. She's got something.
Right.
You know, she's got some talent, but this guy doesn't let up. So Larry is a big guy.
Like
I mean,
big...
over 300 pounds.
Okay.
And he goes up to him and says, you should back off, you know. And the producer, being the producer, said, you know, you mind your own business. I know what I'm doing. Just get behind those drums. You do what I tell you, blah, 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 blah. Well, Larry took enough guff through the years. He looks at him and says, you know what, pal? You're fired. Guy looks at him and says, you can't fire me. He says, oh, yeah, I can arrange it. He says, you're off this project. He said, me and the boys, we're going to produce this. And so they all go to Chet Atkins. Chet Atkins says, no, Larry doesn't want you. You're not there. So, anyways, they put out the album. And as they say, the rest is history, because the person doing the recording was Dolly Parton.
Oh.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And it's like Larry would have stories. He'd say, yeah, there I am shopping, you know, with my wife coming down the aisle. Who do I see but Dolly Parton pushing a cart?
This is in Nashville.
This is in Nashville, yeah.
Oh,
Nashville's a great little town.
Mm-hmm. You lived there for a while.
Yes, yes. And it's quite surprising, some of the people you run into, you know. I was in a little mall, and a storekeeper looked at me and says, you see that girl down there, down the aisle? And I look, and there's like 4 women talking together.
Right.
I said, oh, the blonde? Yeah, the blonde. I said, you know who that is? I said, no. Yeah, very attractive, you know.
Sure.
But no, I have no idea. I said, oh, that's Carrie Underwood.
Oh, wow.
So it's one of those funny little places. You go to symphony, and next thing you know, there's, you know, George Strait or somebody there, you know, with you. It's a very personal little town now.
Sure. I remember being at one of the Christmas parties that you had at your place, and there was some musicians there, and just talking to them, and they all had Grammys under their belts, and they were all going to these music awards and whatnot, and they were people who worked in the factory and people that you knew, and
Yep.
They were all musicians and very accomplished as well.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Nashville is all types of music going on, not just country. It's a lot of rock, a lot of symphonic music that's played there. Nashville's got a very, very nice symphony. Brand new hall. You know, they got flooded out years ago, but nonetheless, quite a bit. And of course, gospel and bluegrass.
Yeah, quite a bit of great music comes and has come from Nashville.
Yeah.
What impresses you in a drummer that you listen to, even if you don't know the band and you're listening to a drummer?
My grandfather was a musician, and he told me, gave me some sage advice once. He said, go and see all the musicians, all the drummers you can. He said, even if you're better than they are, you can pick up on certain things that will help you. And so I look for some different things. Drummers that play the same, you know, I'm not that impressed no matter how good they are. But drummers that have something unique, that is, you know, what I look at and I admire. And some of them have done very well. There's a guy named Steve Gadd, who I got to know many years ago when we were both young. And he became a big session drummer out of New York, well-schooled, etc. But he has this thing that we call playing behind the beat.
Okay.
It's almost like he's dragging the beat on the music, but it doesn't feel like the song's being dragged down or anything like that. Now, he's played with some very notable people, and one of them was Paul Simon.
Okay.
And back in the day of Simon Garfunkel, but Paul Simon when he was a solo act. And he's done quite a bit of his recordings. And if you listen to the drums, like 50 Ways to Leave Your Lover,
Right.
that's a beat that Steve Gadd had been playing and practicing by himself. There was something to the count there that he wanted to get down. He had it in his head, but it took a long time for him to figure it out. And so when they went in to do 50 Ways, Steve said, "Gee, Paul, I think I got something that might fit in this song." And again, as they say, the rest is history.
Right.
And but Steve is always on there. But it's a style. It's a something that has led the charge for a lot of others.
Well, this has been a quality episode, possibly one of the best. I want to thank my father-in-law, Daniel Barker, for being on this episode. Thank you.
So you had to come all the way to Florida.
That's right. And it's not even a question of wanting to come to Florida, but we have so many of our listeners saying, when are you going to do another episode with your father-in-law? So
yeah, right.
I swear we get a ton of emails asking for you to be on our show. So that said, if you want to hear more with Daniel Barker, go to our Patreon page. So patreon.com/The Insomnia Project, and there's more content there. So if you follow into one of our tiers, you'll see the content that you can get with Daniel Barker. Until the next time that I'm in Florida.
Look at this, I put my wife asleep.
There you go. She's on the bed in the hotel room right now, fast asleep. Until next time, I want to thank you. As always, The Insomnia Project is produced by Drumcast Productions, and this episode was recorded in Tampa, Florida. And this is Marco just popping back in here to let you know that this particular interview went longer than our 26 minutes. And Dan talks more about drummers and people he's known and fun little stories about famous people in the music industry. If you want to hear that additional content, it is available on our Patreon page. So if you go to patreon.com/The Insomnia Project, that's patreon.com/The Insomnia Project, you can get the second half or the continuation of this episode where Dan goes into more detail. I know there's a lot of fans of Dan out there, so if you're a Dan fan, go to our Patreon page.